Now, media reports suggest that NATO did a number of adjustments for Trump, for instance, keeping leaders' comments short, making topics more interesting and keeping Russia off their official meeting agenda. How have NATO officials been feeling about accommodating Trump this time?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Well, it's difficult to predict or to interpret how they're feeling, but it's basically been a meeting, not a summit, that has been surrounded by a lot of anxiety from all in Brussels and also from European capitals. So I think what we're hoping to see from this meeting today is a bit more of a clear idea of where Trump stands on NATO and on the alliance. And for the NATO officials, that means that they hope that the steps that they have taken to accommodate his positions really will lead to a clearer commitment to the alliance and to a clearer understanding of where we stand at the moment on the transatlantic relationship and where NATO can go in the next few years.
Mr. O'Hanlon, now traditionally the first meeting between US President and NATO leaders is a get-to-know-each-other meeting. How is Trump's debut different from his predecessors already?
Well, of course, as Julia said, there's been an effort to make this a little less official, or at least a little less lengthy in some of the conversations and presentations. But most of all, it's because Donald Trump, of course, is a maverick and populist politician of a type we really haven't had in the United States in my adult lifetime, in decades at least. And therefore, all the questions that he's raised about how he will govern, especially in regards to NATO and Russia, have caused a great deal of anxiety, as Julia correctly mentioned. I agree with her. I think that actually things, however, are a little calmer now than they might have been 2 or 3 months ago. After all, President Trump has chosen people like Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster to lead his national security team. They've said some fairly strongly reassuring things about NATO. And of course, Trump has also now been a little more critical of Russia and Putin. There doesn't seem the same danger that there was 6 to 12 months ago that he might wind up just creating this little informal alliance of strongmen because he had a certain predilection for Vladimir Putin. There seems to be a little bit more reasoning going into how U.S. policy towards Russia is developed. And I think there's also a reaffirmation of sanctions against Russia over Ukraine and a reaffirmation of the European Reassurance Initiative, or Operation Atlantic Resolve, the effort by NATO to strengthen its deterrent in the eastern NATO member states. So I'm a little calmer and a little more reassured than I would have been a few months ago, but I agree with Julia, it's still a very important meeting.
Now, Trump will unveil a section of the World Trade Center, officially named the 9/11 and Article 5 Memorial, signifying the only time in its history that NATO invoked the Mutual Defense Clause and helped fight al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Ms. Himmrich, where does Trump stand on Article 5? Has he articulated on this issue yet?
Well, that is obviously a very important question for a lot of European NATO members. As we know, he has actually put that into question, that kind of solidarity that actually is the fundament of the NATO alliance. So it will be interesting to see whether this was just an off-the-cuff remark or if this is actually something that he's willing to question again. I do assume that there are high expectations that there will be some kind of commitment to Article 5 at this meeting, and that Trump will make a statement in that regard. It's definitely something that would be very welcome from European NATO allies. It is, to that extent, I think it is really important. It's not on the agenda, obviously, but it's something that is on everybody's mind, and it will be an important thing to watch.
And also good for optics as well. Mr. O'Hanlon, now this memorial hopes to remind Trump NATO is valuable even when there are disagreements. Right now, what is the biggest disagreement between the United States and NATO?
Well, the biggest disagreement is probably about burden sharing, which is sort of the flip side of Article 5. For those of your viewers who don't remember Article 5, they may want to Google it or read it with care because it actually is not quite as categorical as some people seem to think. What it says, it's essentially the mutual defense pact or pledge that says an attack on one is an attack on all, and if there's an attack on any NATO member, then others will consider all means within their power in response. It does not automatically require any particular type of military response. And of course, most NATO allies are not very capable of making a major military response, even if their rhetorical commitment to Article 5 is unambiguous. So in a way, Donald Trump is saying, maybe I'll maintain a little bit of ambiguity in my rhetoric, because it turns out that my country is really the military backbone of this alliance, not just because it's the biggest, but because we're one of the only NATO allies that's reaching or exceeding our 2% pledge, that 2% of gross domestic product would be spent on our armed forces. And so, you know, I don't see Trump as the only villain here, so to speak. I really think he has a point that European countries that expect America to be the backstopper of alliance security actually, in some cases, need to do a lot more. And I look around at countries like Germany, which is spending about 1.2% of its GDP on its military. This is an unacceptably low level. And some of what Trump's saying, you know, has merit. In fact, other Americans over the years have tried to say similar things, but been more polite and diplomatic about it, not allowed any doubt about Article 5 to creep in. And they've been unsuccessful. They've been unsuccessful. So I think Trump is simply upping the ante a little. I would prefer that he not leave any doubt about Article 5, because I'm nervous about how Russia could interpret that. But I sort of see what he's trying to do, and it's not without some basis in reality and in fact.
Another very important subject that's being discussed this time is anti-terrorism. Now, while Trump has been calling for a bigger NATO role in anti-terrorism, and NATO is enhancing its presence on their eastern flank with battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. So, Julia, why do the United States and EU nations disagree so much on whether Russia is a threat to Europe? Or are they still disagreeing?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question?
Yeah, so as I'm saying, you know, Trump has been asking NATO to put more emphasis in fighting terrorism, whereas NATO is seeing Russia more of a threat, as we have seen NATO stepping up its presence in the eastern flank. Why do the US and the EU or NATO countries disagree so much on the issue of Russia, and whether do you think that that is still a very big disagreement at this moment?
Well, we see that Russia isn't on the agenda, as you said earlier, and we don't actually know what the US policy is on Russia at the moment. We're still waiting to really get a clear idea of that, and that also includes what that could mean potentially for the NATO approach towards Russia. So last year, allies agreed on keeping up a dialogue and a deterrence approach when it comes to Russia, and that has obviously been embraced by the United States as well. They've also deployed troops to Poland, for example. So it's clearly something that if you look at what NATO is doing, that the United States is participating and not in any way undermining those efforts. But we don't really know what is happening behind closed doors, what the longer term strategy is of Trump when it comes to Russia. And clearly putting a focus on anti-terrorism and asking NATO to join that coalition is possibly one approach of Trump to basically change the focus of NATO and of the alliance overall, which obviously hasn't really been welcomed by a lot of NATO allies in Europe. Even in Europe, countries are divided on what is the best approach when it comes to Russia. We've seen the European Union has been able to uphold its sanctions, and it's been an agreement on that, but that hasn't been very easy. There has been a lot of opposition towards that from different political factions in Europe. And we've seen the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who's tried to increase those sanctions, but that wasn't possible. So even in Europe, I wouldn't say that we're necessarily everyone's on the same page when it comes to Russia.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. That was Michael E. O'Hanlon, Senior Research Fellow from Brookings Institution, and Julia Himmrich, Research Fellow at the London-based think tank European Leadership Network.